The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the empty office floor. Marcus pushed the mop in slow, deliberate strokes, the rhythmic squeak of the handle, the only sound breaking the silence. It was past midnight, and the building was deserted, just the way he liked it. No one to stare, no one to laugh. But tonight, the quiet felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. He paused, leaning on the mop, and glanced at the framed photos lining the walls, smiling executives, award ceremonies, success stories. Stories he'd never be a part of. Or so he thought. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, sharp and out of place. Marcus turned, his heart skipping a beat. The CEO, Richard Hargrove, strode into the room, his tailored suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to Marcus's worn uniform. "Still here, janitor?" Richard's voice was cold, dripping with disdain. Marcus straightened, his grip tightening on the mop. "Just finishing up, sir." Richard smirked, glancing around the room like he owned it, which, of course, he did. "You know, I've always wondered," he said, his tone mocking. "What does a man like you dream about? Mopping floors for the rest of your life?" The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Marcus felt the familiar sting of humiliation, the weight of every insult he'd ever swallowed pressing down on him. But this time, something shifted. He looked Richard in the eye, his voice steady. "Maybe I dream of more." Richard laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the room. "More? You? Don't make me laugh." But Marcus didn't flinch. He stood there, the mop in his hand, and for the first time, he felt something dangerous, a spark of defiance. "What if I told you," Marcus said slowly, "that one day, I'd own this company?" Richard's laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You're delusional," he said, his voice low. "A janitor buying this company? That'll be the day." Marcus didn't respond. He just watched as Richard turned on his heel and walked away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. Alone again, Marcus looked down at the mop in his hands. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It was a symbol of everything he'd been, everything they thought he'd always be. But as he stood there in the empty office, the spark inside him grew into a flame. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to prove them wrong. All of them. And it all started tonight. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the empty office floor. Marcus pushed the mop in slow, deliberate strokes, the rhythmic squeak of the handle, the only sound breaking the silence. It was past midnight, and the building was deserted, just the way he liked it. No one to stare, no one to laugh. But tonight, the quiet felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. He paused, leaning on the mop, and glanced at the framed photos lining the walls, smiling executives, award ceremonies, success stories. Stories he'd never be a part of. Or so he thought. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, sharp and out of place. Marcus turned, his heart skipping a beat. The CEO, Richard Hargrove, strode into the room, his tailored suit and polished shoes a stark contrast to Marcus's worn uniform. "Still here, janitor?" Richard's voice was cold, dripping with disdain. Marcus straightened, his grip tightening on the mop. "Just finishing up, sir." Richard smirked, glancing around the room like he owned it, which, of course, he did. "You know, I've always wondered," he said, his tone mocking. "What does a man like you dream about? Mopping floors for the rest of your life?" The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Marcus felt the familiar sting of humiliation, the weight of every insult he'd ever swallowed pressing down on him. But this time, something shifted. He looked Richard in the eye, his voice steady. "Maybe I dream of more." Richard laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the room. "More? You? Don't make me laugh." But Marcus didn't flinch. He stood there, the mop in his hand, and for the first time, he felt something dangerous, a spark of defiance. "What if I told you," Marcus said slowly, "that one day, I'd own this company?" Richard's laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You're delusional," he said, his voice low. "A janitor buying this company? That'll be the day." Marcus didn't respond. He just watched as Richard turned on his heel and walked away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. Alone again, Marcus looked down at the mop at his hands. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It was a symbol of everything he'd been, everything they thought he'd always be. But as he stood there in the empty office, the spark inside him grew into a flame. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to prove them wrong. All of them. And it all started tonight. The news spread quickly through the office, whispered in hushed tones over coffee breaks and muttered in the hallways. Richard Hargrove was selling the company. The once mighty empire he'd built was crumbling, and the vultures were circling. Employees exchanged nervous glances, wondering if they'd still have jobs by the end of the month. But Marcus saw something else entirely. He'd spent the last few days poring over his notebook, refining his ideas, and drafting a plan. It was risky, borderline insane, but it was the only shot he had. Carl had agreed to help, though he still thought Marcus was out of his mind. "You realize this is suicide, right?" Carl had said, leaning against the storage closet door. "Hargrove's not just going to hand over the company to some janitor." "I'm not asking him to hand it over," Marcus replied, his voice calm. "I'm going to take it." The first step was getting a meeting with Hargrove. That, as it turned out, was easier said than done. Marcus had spent hours rehearsing what he'd say, how he'd present himself, but none of that mattered if he couldn't get past the gatekeepers. He tried the direct approach first, walking up to Hargrove's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn, and asking for 5 minutes of the CEO's time. She'd looked him up and down, her expression a mix of confusion and disdain. "Mr. Hargrove doesn't take meetings with maintenance staff," she'd said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Marcus had expected that. What he hadn't expected was the way it stung. He'd walked away, his face burning, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The next day, he tried again, this time with Carl's help. Carl had managed to get his hands on Hargrove's schedule, and they'd planned to intercept him as he left a meeting. But when the moment came, Marcus froze. Hargrove strode down the hallway, flanked by 2 executives, his voice sharp and commanding. Marcus stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Mr. Hargrove, I need to talk to you." Hargrove barely glanced at him. "Not now," he said, brushing past like Marcus was nothing more than a piece of furniture. Marcus stood there, his fists clenched, feeling the weight of every insult, every dismissal he'd ever endured. But this time, instead of shrinking back, he felt something else, anger. That night, he sat in the storage closet, staring at his notebook. He'd been so sure he could do this, so sure he could make them see him as more than just a janitor. But maybe Carl was right. Maybe this was suicide. And then, as if the universe had decided to test him, the door creaked open. It wasn't Carl this time. It was Evelyn. She stepped inside, her heels clicking against the concrete floor, and closed the door behind her. For a long moment, she just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke. "What's your game, Marcus?" Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "What? You've been trying to get a meeting with Hargrove," she said, crossing her arms. "Why?" Marcus hesitated. He didn't trust her, not after the way she dismissed him earlier, but something in her tone made him think twice. "I have an idea," he said slowly. "A way to save the company." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You, a janitor?" The word stung, but Marcus held her gaze. "Yeah, me." For a moment, she just stared at him. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts aren't enough. You're going to need a lot more than that to take on Hargrove." Marcus frowned. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "that I might be able to help you. But if we're going to do this, you need to trust me." Marcus studied her face, searching for any sign of deception, but all he saw was determination. "Why would you help me?" Evelyn's smile faded. "Because I'm tired of working for a man who doesn't care about anyone but himself, and because I think you might actually have a shot at this." It was a risk, trusting her, but Marcus didn't have many options left. "All right," he said finally. "What's the plan?" Evelyn leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "First, you're in a need to prove yourself. Hargrove's hosting a gala next week. It's his last-ditch effort to impress potential buyers. If you can get in front of him there, you might just have a chance." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. "And how do I get in?" Evelyn smirked. "Leave that to me." The next few days were a blur. Marcus worked double shifts, saving every penny he could, while Evelyn pulled strings to get him an invitation to the gala. Carl helped too, lending Marcus his only suit and teaching him how to tie a tie. "You're going to need to look the part," Carl said, adjusting the collar. "Can't have you showing up looking like a janitor." The night of the gala, Marcus stood outside the venue, his heart pounding. The building was lit up like a beacon, the sound of laughter and music spilling out into the night. He took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and walked inside. The room was a sea of suits and dresses, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and champagne. Marcus felt out of place, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He had a mission. He spotted Hargrove across the room, holding court with a group of investors. Marcus started toward him, his palms sweating, but before he could get close, a hand grabbed his arm. It was Evelyn. "Not yet," she whispered, pulling him aside. "You need to wait for the right moment." Marcus nodded, his nerves on edge. He spent the next hour mingling, trying to blend in, but every time he got close to Hargrove, something stopped him. Finally, as the night wore on, Evelyn gave him the signal. "Now," she said, her voice firm. Marcus took a deep breath and walked up to Hargrove, his heart pounding in his chest. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, his voice steady. "I need to talk to you." Hargrove turned, his expression darkening when he saw who it was. "You again? What part of 'not now' don't you understand?" Marcus didn't flinch. "I have a proposal, a way to save your company." Hargrove laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You, a janitor? What could you possibly have to offer?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to them. Marcus felt the weight of their stares, the pressure building in his chest. But he didn't back down. "Try me," he said, his voice calm. For a moment, Hargrove just stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then he smirked. "All right, janitor. Let's hear it." Marcus took a deep breath and began to speak. And in that moment, everything changed. The room was silent, every eye fixed on Marcus as he stood before Richard Hargrove. He could feel the weight of their stares, the pressure building in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his head, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. "Your company is dying," Marcus began, his voice steady. "You've lost touch with your employees, your customers, even your own vision. But it doesn't have to be this way. I have a plan, a way to turn things around." Hargrove's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. "Go on." Marcus took a deep breath and laid out his proposal. He spoke about innovation, about reinvesting in the workforce, about rebuilding the company from the ground up. His words were passionate, his ideas bold, and for a moment, it seemed like he might actually get through to Hargrove. But then the CEO laughed. It started as a low chuckle, but it quickly grew into a full-blown roar. The investors joined in, their laughter echoing through the room like a wave. Marcus stood there, his face burning, feeling the weight of every insult, every dismissal he'd ever endured. "You really think you can save this company?" Hargrove said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're a janitor, Marcus. Stick to what you know." The room erupted in laughter again, and Marcus felt the ground crumbling beneath him. He'd been so sure, so confident, but now it all seemed like a foolish dream. He turned and walked away, the sound of laughter ringing in his ears. The next few days were a blur. Marcus threw himself into his work, scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins with a ferocity that surprised even Carl. He didn't talk about the gala, didn't mention Hargrove or the proposal. He just worked, trying to drown out the voice in his head that told him he'd failed. But Carl wasn't about to let him off that easy. "You can't just give up, man," Carl said one night, leaning against the mop bucket. "You went toe-to-toe with Hargrove. That's more than anyone else has done." Marcus shook his head, his hands gripping the mop handle. "It doesn't matter. He's not going to listen to me. No one is." "So what? You're just gonna let him win?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have one. Meanwhile, the company's situation was growing more dire. Rumors of layoffs spread like wildfire, and the tension in the office was palpable. Employees walked on eggshells, their faces etched with worry, while Hargrove remained locked in his office, refusing to address the growing unrest. Marcus watched it all from the sidelines, his frustration mounting. He tried to help, tried to make a difference, but it hadn't been enough. And then, one night, everything changed. Marcus was cleaning the executive floor when he overheard a conversation. Two of Hargrove's top advisors were in the boardroom, their voices low but urgent. "If we don't find a buyer soon, we're done," one of them said. "We're already done," the other replied. "Hargrove's too stubborn to admit it, but this ship is sinking." Marcus froze, his heart pounding. He'd known the company was in trouble, but hearing it like that, so blunt and unvarnished, made it real. He waited until the advisors left, then slipped into the boardroom. The table was littered with papers, financial reports, projections, proposals. Marcus scanned them quickly, his mind racing. The company was in worse shape than he'd thought, but buried in the chaos was an opportunity. He grabbed a stack of papers and hurried back to the storage closet, his heart pounding. He spent the rest of the night poring over the documents, piecing together a plan. By morning, he had a new proposal. The next day, Marcus went straight to Evelyn. She was at her desk, typing furiously, but she looked up when he approached. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I need your help," Marcus said, holding up the stack of papers. "I have a new plan, but I can't do it alone." Evelyn studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You're not going to give up, are you?" Marcus shook his head. "Not this time." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's hear it." Marcus laid out his new plan, his voice steady despite the nerves churning in his gut. He spoke about restructuring the company, about cutting unnecessary expenses and reinvesting in key areas. He talked about transparency, about rebuilding trust with employees and customers alike. Evelyn listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "It's a good plan," she said finally. "But Hargrove's never going to go for it." "Then we'll go around him," Marcus said. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "And how do you propose we do that?" Marcus smiled. "We take it to the board." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Evelyn used her connections to set up a meeting with the board of directors, while Marcus worked tirelessly to refine his proposal. Carl helped too, spreading the word among the employees and rallying support. But not everyone was on board. Hargrove caught wind of their plan and was furious. He called Marcus into his office, his face red with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Hargrove demanded, slamming his fist on the desk. "I'm trying to save this company," Marcus replied, his voice calm. "You're overstepping," Hargrove snapped. "You're a janitor, Marcus. Know your place." Marcus met his gaze, his jaw clenched. "My place is wherever I can make a difference, and right now that's here." Hargrove stared at him, his eyes blazing, but for the first time, Marcus didn't back down. The day of the board meeting arrived, and Marcus stood outside the conference room, his heart pounding. He'd never been more nervous in his life, but he couldn't afford to let it show. Evelyn was by his side, her expression calm but determined. "You ready for this?" she asked. Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. "Let's do it." They walked into the room together, the board members turning to look at them with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Marcus stepped up to the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he laid out his proposal. He spoke with passion, with conviction, laying out a vision for the company that was bold, innovative, and most importantly, achievable. The board listened in silence, their expressions unreadable. When he finished, the room was quiet, too quiet, and then, one by one, the board members began to nod. But the victory was short-lived. Hargrove stormed into the room, his face red with rage. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You're seriously considering this?" From a janitor. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but before anyone could respond, Marcus stepped forward. "It's not about who I am," he said, his voice steady. "It's about what's best for the company. And if you can't see that, then maybe it's time for you to step aside." The room fell silent, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Hargrove stared at Marcus, his eyes blazing, but for the first time, Marcus didn't flinch. And in that moment, everything hung in the balance. The room was electric, the air thick with tension as Marcus and Hargrove stood face to face. The board members watched in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the two men like spectators at a high-stakes poker game. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he didn't back down. This was it, the moment he'd been fighting for. Hargrove's face was a mask of fury, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you can waltz in here and take my company?" he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You're nothing but a janitor, Marcus. A nobody." Marcus held his ground, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe I was a nobody, but not anymore. This company doesn't belong to you, Hargrove. It belongs to the people who work here, to the customers who believe in it. And if you can't see that, then you don't deserve to lead it." The room erupted in murmurs, the board members exchanging uneasy glances. Hargrove's face turned crimson, his chest heaving as he struggled to contain his anger. "You're out of your league," he snarled. "You don't have the money, the connections, the power to pull this off." Marcus didn't flinch. "Maybe not, but I have something you don't, a vision, and I'm not afraid to fight for it." For a moment, Hargrove just stared at him, his eyes blazing. Then he turned to the board, his voice sharp and commanding. "This is ridiculous. You can't seriously be considering this. He's a janitor, for God's sake." The board members shifted uncomfortably, their expressions torn. Finally, one of them, a silver-haired man named Charles, cleared his throat. "Richard, we understand your concerns, but the fact is, the company is in trouble, and Marcus's proposal, it has merit." Hargrove's jaw dropped. "You're siding with him?" Charles hesitated, then nodded. "We're siding with the company, and right now, Marcus's plan is the best chance we have." The room fell silent, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Marcus felt a surge of hope, but he didn't let it show. He knew this wasn't over yet. Hargrove's face twisted in fury, his voice rising to a shout. "This is my company. I built it from the ground up. You can't just hand it over to some janitor." Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady. "It's not your company anymore, Hargrove. It's ours. And if you can't accept that, then maybe it's time for you to step aside." The room erupted in chaos, the board members shouting over each other as Hargrove stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Marcus stood there, his heart pounding, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a start. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The board voted to move forward with Marcus's plan, but the road ahead was far from smooth. Hargrove fought back with everything he had, using his influence and connections to undermine Marcus at every turn. Employees were divided, some rallying behind Marcus, while others remained loyal to Hargrove. The tension in the office was palpable, the air thick with uncertainty and fear. Marcus worked tirelessly, meeting with department heads, reviewing financial reports, and laying the groundwork for the changes he wanted to make. But every step forward felt like a battle, every victory hard-won. Carl was by his side through it all, offering support and encouragement when Marcus needed it most. "You're doing the right thing, man," Carl said one night as they sat in the storage closet, the glow of a single bulb casting long shadows on the walls. "Don't let Hargrove get to you." Marcus nodded, but the doubt lingered. "What if I'm not enough, Carl? What if I can't do this?" Carl leaned forward, his expression serious. "You're already doing it, Marcus. You've got the vision, the drive, the heart. That's more than Hargrove ever had." Marcus smiled, feeling a flicker of hope. "Thanks, Carl. I needed to hear that." But the challenges kept coming. Hargrove launched a smear campaign, spreading rumors and lies about Marcus in an attempt to discredit him. The media picked up the story, painting Marcus as an opportunist, a fraud. The pressure was relentless, and Marcus felt it weighing on him more and more each day. He barely slept, barely ate, pouring every ounce of energy into the fight. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, Hargrove made his move. He called an emergency board meeting, demanding a vote of no confidence in Marcus's leadership. The room was tense, the board members' faces grim as they listened to Hargrove's arguments. "This man is a janitor," Hargrove said, his voice dripping with disdain. "He has no experience, no qualifications, no right to lead this company. If you let him continue, he'll destroy everything we've built." Marcus stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding as he waited for his turn to speak. When it came, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I may not have the experience or the qualifications," he said, his voice steady. "But I have something Hargrove doesn't, a vision for the future. A vision that puts people first, that values innovation and integrity over profit and power. And if that's not enough for you, then maybe I'm not the right person for this job. But I can promise you this. I'll fight for this company with everything I've got, because I believe in it, and I believe in the people who make it great." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. And then, one by one, they began to nod. The vote was unanimous. Marcus would remain in charge, and Hargrove was out. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. Marcus stood there, feeling the weight of the responsibility settle on his shoulders. He'd fought so hard to get here, but now the real work began. As he left the boardroom, Carl and Evelyn were waiting for him. "You did it, man," Carl said, clapping him on the back. "You actually did it." Evelyn smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "You've got a long road ahead of you, Marcus. But if anyone can do this, it's you." Marcus nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. "Thanks, both of you. I couldn't have done this without you." That night, Marcus stood in the empty office, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the only sound breaking the silence. He looked around at the walls, the desks, the people who had become his family. He'd come so far, but he knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in his life, Marcus felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. And as he stood there, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders, he knew one thing for certain. He was ready, ready to lead, ready to fight, ready to build something great. And nothing, not Hargrove, not the doubters, not the challenges ahead, was going to stop him. 6 months later, the company was unrecognizable. The halls that had once been filled with tension and uncertainty now buzzed with energy and optimism. Marcus had kept his promise. He'd fought for the company, for its people, and for the vision he believed in. And it was paying off. The changes hadn't been easy. There had been long nights, tough decisions, and moments when Marcus had doubted himself. But through it all, he'd held onto the belief that the company could be more than just a business. It could be a family. The employees had rallied behind him, their loyalty and hard work driving the company's turnaround. Profits were up, morale was high, and the future looked brighter than ever. But for Marcus, the real victory wasn't in the numbers. It was in the people. He walked through the office, greeting employees by name, listening to their ideas, and celebrating their successes. He'd made it a point to be accessible, to lead with humility and empathy. And it showed. Carl had been promoted to head of security, his loyalty and dedication earning him the respect of the entire team. Evelyn had taken on a leadership role in operations, her sharp mind and unwavering support making her an invaluable asset. And Marcus, he was still the same man he'd always been, humble, hardworking, and determined to make a difference. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus stood in the lobby, looking out at the city skyline. The office was quiet, the day's work done, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Carl found him there, a cup of coffee in hand. "You gonna stand here all night, boss?" he asked, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Marcus smiled, taking the coffee. "Just thinking." "About what?" "Everything," Marcus said, his voice soft. "How far we've come, How much further we have to go? Carl nodded, his expression thoughtful. You've done a hell of a job, Marcus. You should be proud. I am, Marcus said. But it's not just me. It's all of us. We did this together. Carl clapped him on the back. Damn right we did. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the office early, as he always did. But today was different. Today was the day of the company's annual gala, a celebration of everything they'd accomplished. The event was held in the lobby, the space transformed into a glittering showcase of success. Employees mingled with investors, their laughter and conversation filling the air. Marcus stood at the edge of the room, watching it all with a sense of pride. Evelyn approached him, a glass of champagne in hand. You did it, she said, her voice warm. You saved this company. Marcus shook his head. We saved it. Together. Evelyn smiled, raising her glass. To the future. Marcus clinked his glass against hers. To the future. As the night wore on, Marcus found himself standing at the podium, the room falling silent as he prepared to speak. He looked out at the faces before him, his team, his family, and felt a surge of emotion. When I first stood in this room, he began, his voice steady. I was just a janitor with a dream. I didn't know if I could make a difference, if I could be more than what people expected of me. But you believed in me. You gave me a chance. And together, we've built something incredible. The room erupted in applause, the sound filling Marcus with a sense of accomplishment he'd never known before. This isn't the end, he continued. It's just the beginning. We've proven what we're capable of, and I can't wait to see what we'll achieve next. As he stepped down from the podium, the room erupted in cheers, the sound echoing through the lobby and out into the night. Later, as the gala wound down, Marcus found himself standing in the same spot where it had all begun. The piano sat in the corner, its polished surface gleaming under the soft light. He walked over to it, running a hand over the keys. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he sat down and began to play. The melody was soft at first, tentative, but as his fingers moved across the keys, the music grew stronger, more confident. It filled the room, a testament to everything he'd overcome, everything he'd achieved. The employees gathered around, their faces filled with awe and admiration. Even Carl and Evelyn stood silently, their eyes shining with pride. As the final note faded away, the room erupted in applause. Marcus stood, his heart full, and looked out at the faces before him. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion, for believing in me, for believing in us. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment settling over them, and then, one by one, they began to cheer, their voices rising in a chorus of celebration and hope. As the night came to an end, Marcus stood at the window, looking out at the city skyline. The lights twinkled like stars, a reminder of how far he'd come. He'd started as a janitor, invisible and overlooked. But now, he was a leader, a visionary, a man who had defied the odds and changed the course of his life. And as he stood there, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The future was bright, and Marcus was ready to face it, ready to lead, ready to inspire, ready to make a difference. And nothing, not the challenges, not the doubters, not the weight of the world, was going to stop him.